She never killed anyone, never wielded a sword, never gave an order to massacre. Yet she is called the greatest traitor in Mexican history. More than 500 years have passed, and her name still lingers like a stain on the soul of a nation. A curse, a symbol of disgrace. A woman who didn't choose where she was born, didn't choose her masters, didn't choose a side, yet history nailed her down as a monster. People don't speak of La Malinche with pity. They curse her in everyday language. Malinchista, a sellout, a traitor to one's roots, a disgrace to national identity. But if we look more closely beyond the lens shaped by men, by conquerors, by nationalist myths, Malinche doesn't appear as a villain. She emerges as a survivor, a teenage girl, handed over like a gift, who became the voice, the shadow, and the conscience of one of the bloodiest conquests in human history. This is not a story about betrayal, it's a story about choice, about a woman caught between two worlds, both of which sought to devour her. And in the end, both came to hate her for daring to survive. La Malinche, the woman rejected by the very blood that bore her. And this is Shadow Historians. We begin where history wants to forget. We don't begin with blazing battles or triumphant marches, but with a small village nestled in the tropical jungles of Mexico's coastline, where the ancient world of the Nahua people was still measured by the cycles of the gods. There, sometime in the late 15th century, a little girl was born with a name the Spanish would never pronounce correctly. Perhaps it was Malinali Tenepatl, a name that sounds like soft grass and whispering wind, a name that evokes fragility, yet also something that bends without breaking, just like the destiny of its bearer. Malinche, as the Spanish would later call her, was not born into poverty. Quite the opposite. She was the daughter of a minor noble family within the Nahua community, likely near Coatzacoalcos, a region that connected bustling trade routes and ancient ceremonial centers. Her father may have been a local nobleman, a man with enough wealth and influence to secure his daughter a place within the tightly stratified society of Mesoamerican tribes. Then he died, and like every classic tragedy, that's when the unraveling began. Her father's death was the moment the gates of hell creaked open. Her mother remarried quickly, and the new stepfather had one thing clear. His wife's daughter would not inherit. Whether out of jealousy, ambition, or the cold logic of patriarchal power, the result was the same. Malinali vanished from the house where she had been born. Perhaps no one cried that night. No goodbyes, no screams. Just a long stretch of silence. The light fading from the rooftop, and Malinali handed off to traders, like a piece of property quietly disposed of before it could threaten the new bloodline. She was not killed. That might seem merciful, but that mercy wore the mask of slavery. She was sold to the Maya, people who spoke a different language, worshipped different gods, and shared no common memory with her. A child, maybe just 10 or 12 years old, thrown into a world where every sound was a blade, unfamiliar, unrelenting, inescapable. At that point, the Spanish hadn't arrived yet. The Aztec Empire still dominated the Central Highlands, demanding tribute from hundreds of tribes. The Maya, politically fractured in the eastern Yucatan, still held firm in cultural pride and identity. Amid this web of trade, tribute, raids, and human exchange, Malinche passed from hand to hand, part of an economy where young women were commodities of value. We don't have Malinche's diary. She never wrote her story. No one ever asked her what she thought. But imagine you are 10, abandoned by your mother, sold far from home, stripped of your language, and forced to learn a new one. You grow up among people who never say your name right, don't know your parents, and don't care who you used to be. Every early memory is smothered under new rules. Don't ask, don't cry, don't remember. Malinche didn't grow up with a people. She grew up with the absence of a people. That's what history refuses to understand. When people call her a traitor, they assume she betrayed a community, an ideal, a motherland. But who did she betray? Did that enslaved teenager even know what her people meant anymore? Did anyone teach her history, tradition, loyalty? By the time the Spanish arrived, Malinche had lived for years among the Maya. She no longer spoke Nahuatl as her first tongue but spoke Maya fluently, like a native. She no longer worshipped the gods of her ancestors but lived inside another belief system. When the Aztecs were mentioned, perhaps to her they were just others. The ones who decapitated captives, demanded tribute, taxed villages, and took people. So if one day she stood between two sides, Spanish invaders and Aztec overlords, whom would she choose? Or rather, was she ever really given a choice? Malinche's greatest gift, and her lifelong sentence, was language. When the Spanish began their assault along the coast of Tabasco, they defeated local forces and were given tribute. Gold, cacao, and 20 women. Among them was Malinche. No one paid much attention to her at first, but then they realized she understood both Maya and Nahuatl. And that's when Malinche, the girl without a home, without a nation, without a name, suddenly became Hernán Cortés's most powerful weapon. Not a sword, not a musket, not a horse, but a voice. But don't get ahead of yourself. That's the story of the next chapter. Here, in this first chapter, we're still in the shadows of a stolen childhood. In the blur of memories no one recorded. In the long silence of a child known to history only after she became the woman of Cortés. We don't know if Malinche ever tried to escape. We don't know how many nights she dreamed of her old village. We don't know if she hated her mother or simply learned to forget. But one thing is certain. She survived. And in a world where men wrote history with blood, to survive through wit, through language, through silence, was the greatest act of resistance. She was the first in Mexican history to be stripped of a nation, then forced to represent that nation as its supposed traitor. A cruel paradox. The only woman who could translate the words of two worlds was hated by both. And maybe that's why, even today, as you walk through the plaza in Mexico City, you might still hear a whisper of a curse. Malinchista. But behind every curse lies the shadow of a little girl, sold in the night, while no one asked a single question. When Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Tabasco in 1519, he had no map, no long-term plan, and no knowledge of the local languages. But he had guns, a cross, an insatiable hunger for conquest, and a blind belief that this entire continent was waiting to be conquered. Cortés had no real understanding of the world he was about to destroy. To him, it was a hazy mystery, filled with gold, strange gods, and grand cities hidden in the jungle. The Aztec Empire, in the eyes of the Spanish, was like a living El Dorado, frightening, seductive, and most importantly, something that had to be conquered. But first, there was a simple problem that every would-be conqueror faces. He didn't speak the language. No one in his steel-helmeted crew spoke Nahuatl, the language of the vast land they were about to invade. And then, as if fate had a twisted sense of humor, the person who would save the entire expedition wasn't a soldier. She was a woman, handed over as a gift after a battlefield victory. One of 20 women offered by the Tabasco chiefs to Cortés as a peace gesture. Among those women, one stood out. She didn't bow. She didn't cry. She didn't beg or try to run. She simply listened. And then she spoke. Malinche. First, her role was unclear. To the Spanish, native women were little more than spoils of war. Good for cooking, tending fires, and warming beds. Cortés distributed the women among his men as rewards. But soon, something unusual happened. They realized she could speak to the locals in Maya. Even more astonishing, she also understood Nahuatl. That's when Cortés pulled her into the center of operations. No longer a post-battle prize, Malinche became the missing piece in the key to unlocking an entire continent. Cortés already had Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spanish friar who had survived a shipwreck and spent years living among the Maya, learning their language. Aguilar spoke Spanish and Maya. Malinche spoke Maya and Nahuatl. By combining the two, Cortés created a three-way translation chain. The Aztec spoke in Nahuatl, Malinche translated to Maya, Aguilar translated to Spanish for Cortés. And vice versa, a strange relay of words passing through three mouths, three cultures, three worldviews. And yet it worked. The first negotiations between Cortés and the local chiefs, Aztec envoys, and regional tribes flowed, thanks to Malinche's voice. And then she learned Spanish. We don't know exactly when she started or how she learned so quickly, but within a few months of leaving Tabasco, Malinche was speaking directly with Cortés. No more Aguilar. No more middlemen. No one to filter her words. At that point, she was no longer just an interpreter. She was an advisor. But how much power does an advisor really have? It's hard to imagine that a native woman, without rank, without soldiers, without a title, could sit beside the most powerful man in the region and whisper things only she understood. But that's exactly where Malinche found herself. Every time Cortés met with local leaders, Malinche was there. When envoys from Tenochtitlan came bearing gifts and warnings from Montezuma, it was Malinche who spoke the messages aloud. When native tribes hesitated, unsure whether to side with the Spanish or the Aztecs, Malinche was the one who negotiated, persuaded, and sometimes threatened. She became the voice of conquest, not because she wanted to, but because she had to, and because she could. Betrayal or survival by intelligence. This is where the shadow of judgment begins to fall across Malinche's name. She has been called La Traidora, the traitor woman. People say she helped Spain destroy ancient Mexican civilization. That without her, Cortés could never have learned how deeply the tribes hated the Aztecs. He wouldn't have found the road to Tenochtitlan. He couldn't have forged alliances, couldn't have divided and conquered. She has been blamed for the entire process of colonization. One woman, without a sword, without a gun, turned into the symbol of a nation's tragedy. But maybe we're asking the wrong question. Instead of, what did she do? We should ask, did she even have a choice? Imagine it. You are a slave. No homeland. No protector. You stand between an unfamiliar army of white men and a civilization you've only heard about in rumors. And you possess something no one else does, the ability to speak, to understand both sides. What would you do? Refuse? Stay silent? Be cast aside? Die in the jungle, replaced by another woman? Or would you rise and use the only weapon you have, your mind, to survive? Malinche didn't just survive. She mastered language, and through it she wielded power. But power cuts both ways. The more she spoke, the more dangerous she became. The more she understood, the more she was hated. Her intelligence wasn't celebrated like a strategist's brilliance. It was twisted into the cunning of a deceitful temptress, a poisonous serpent, a native Eve who lured paradise to its fall. In history written by men, a smart woman is frightening. A woman who speaks both worlds' languages is the most dangerous of all. There's a passage in the writings of Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortés's army, that describes Malinche like this: without her, we could not speak, could not understand, could not negotiate with anyone. She was the only thing that kept us from being killed by our own ignorance. Sounds like praise, but it's also a sentence. If the Spaniards survived because of her, then the deaths of thousands of natives must also trace back to her. Malinche and Cortés, powerful partners or privileged prisoner. Their relationship is one of the most complex pieces of this story. They weren't lovers in the traditional sense. She was a prisoner, a spoil of war, a slave, but also the one person Cortés absolutely needed to communicate with an entire continent. They slept together. She bore him a son, Martín, considered one of the first mestizos of Mexico, a child of two bloodlines, two worlds, a living symbol of both blending and conquest. Malinche didn't choose love, but maybe, just maybe, she chose to use that position to maintain her influence. Unlike other women discarded after one night, Malinche remained by Cortés's side throughout the campaign, until Tenochtitlan fell. She didn't vanish after sharing a bed with the conqueror. She sat with him in strategic meetings. She stood beside him in royal audiences with Montezuma. She spoke words of peace, and, when needed, translated orders for execution. She was the intermediary, but every go-between must pick a side, and history picked for her. Is that why we hate her? Malinche wasn't the first to be caught between two civilizations, but she's one of the few to become a national symbol of selling out, of corruption, of betrayal. But ask yourself, If you've been a slave since childhood, who are you supposed to be loyal to? If you have no homeland, who are you betraying? If you're rejected by both worlds, who do you belong to? Malinche didn't betray her people. Her people betrayed her first. And so, her voice became a weapon, but also a sentence. She used language to survive, then to negotiate, then to plead with Cortés not to kill more. But in the end, those very words, the ones no one else could understand, became her guilt in the eyes of history. Malinche didn't rewrite history. She only translated it. But when that history is one of conquest, bloodshed, and genocide, the translator will never be forgiven. In the imagined courtroom of Mexico's national memory, Malinche is still on trial. The charge? Betrayal. The evidence? She spoke. The witness? A dead language. But maybe, on a deeper level of history, we'll see a woman standing between two swords, not raising a weapon but lifting her mind. And in that world, Malinche is not a traitor. She is the last one who survived. Beneath the shadows of ancient forests and basalt pyramids cracked by time, a woman was whispering into the ear of a conqueror. She carried no sword, wore no armor, bore no crest of the Spanish crown or gleaming helmet. But every word she spoke had the power to bring a city to its knees. To call La Malinche merely a translator would be an insult to the quiet, ruthless power she wielded, because she, perhaps more than anyone, understood this. Nothing is more dangerous than a whisper spoken at the right moment, to the right ear. At that time, Hernán Cortés was no god, just a rebel who had disobeyed the governor of Cuba, launching an unauthorized expedition not sanctioned by the Spanish crown. His gleaming cannons were not enough to shield him from an entire Aztec Empire watching from above, from blood-soaked temples, with eyes full of suspicion and obsidian daggers just waiting for an excuse to strike. Cortés knew it. Malinche knew it too. But rather than confront the empire head-on, she whispered a strategy into his ear. Don't attack. Not yet. Divide them first. The first to heed her persuasion were the Totonac, a confederation of coastal clans long bled dry by Aztec taxes, tributes, and the constant demand for sacrificial lives. When Cortés first met them, the Totonac were wary. Who wouldn't be, when faced with pale-skinned strangers, bearded on horseback, devouring food like demons? But when Malinche spoke to them in their own tongue, without an intermediary, their gaze shifted. They heard their own pain spoken in their own voice. And then, she painted a future for them, a future where they no longer paid tribute to Tenochtitlan, a future without Montezuma, a future they could shape for themselves. For the first time in generations, the Totonac began to dream. Cortés didn't need dreams. He needed soldiers. He needed allies. And through Malinche he got both. But the boldest and most brilliant move came next, when Cortés's forces entered the lands of the Tlaxcalans. These warriors had battled the Aztecs for centuries. They were no strangers to war, and not easily convinced. In their first clash, the Tlaxcalans nearly killed Cortés, if not for Spanish horses and cannons. But after the battle, Malinche was sent to the prisoners' camp, not to negotiate a peace treaty, but to plant doubt. She likely said very little, just enough to let them know the Spaniards hadn't come to kill them, but to help them bring down the Aztecs. If they were willing to listen. We will never know exactly what Malinche said. There are no records from her, no diary, no defense in her own words. Only the consequences. The Tlaxcalans, Tenochtitlan's age-old enemies, became Cortés's fiercest allies. In the months that followed, thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors marched alongside Spanish soldiers over mountains and swamps to besiege and ultimately destroy the Aztec capital. It wasn't Spain that conquered Mexico. It was a civil war. And Malinche blew the opening whistle. Pause for a moment and think. A woman with no army, no money, no official power in any structure, managed to persuade rival tribes, shift allegiances, and lay the groundwork for the collapse of an empire. With nothing but words. With quiet negotiations, whispers no one else could hear. Stories of suffering and hope told in a woman's voice. Gentle, but sharp as a blade. This wasn't betrayal. This was strategic architecture. And it's all the more remarkable coming from someone who had once been a slave, bartered from one master to another, stripped of every marker of dignity. They say true power is the ability to influence others without violence. If that's true, then Malinche wasn't just powerful. She was a master. And that made her dangerous. In a world where power was defined by men, by weapons, by royal seals and church medals, the idea of an indigenous woman with no title offering strategic advice to the leader of a conquest army was unforgivable. Perhaps that's why her image was twisted for centuries. No one spoke of her as a strategist, a diplomat, a builder of alliances. They just called her La Chingada, the violated one. Her name became a curse, a symbol of shame, as if her intelligence were something vile, something to be hidden away, a stain on history. But here's something else to consider. If Malinche had been a man, would she have been cursed the same way? We celebrate Machiavelli, though he never lifted a sword. We admire Talleyrand, who could steer Napoleon with words. But Malinche, the one who made Cortés rethink his entire conquest, was labeled a traitor. The price of intelligence, when it lies in the hands of the powerless, is never cheap. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all is that even those she helped turned their backs on her. After Tenochtitlan fell, after Cortés was named governor of New Spain, Malinche faded from the spotlight. There was no honor, no statue, no thanks. Just a woman who had once been useful, and then left behind by history. Maybe she knew that from the beginning. Maybe she understood that no matter how much she helped Cortés, she would never be one of them. But she chose to do it anyway, not out of loyalty to the conquerors, but out of loyalty to survival, hers, and perhaps that of other indigenous women like her. In a world ruled by men, native or foreign, Malinche chose to wield the one thing men could never fully control: language. And perhaps on some quiet night, when the campfires burned low and Cortés sat staring at a blank map of the New World, he would call her over and ask, "What are they thinking? What will they do next?" And Malinche, with a face still as stone and a voice soft as mist, would speak a new truth, a new direction, a new strategy, without a sound, without a drop of blood, because that was how she fought. In whispers, and yet she changed the world. In the summer of 1521, the surface of Lake Texcoco no longer mirrored the majestic temples of Tenochtitlan like a peaceful sheet of glass. Instead, it reeked of blood, gunpowder, and the stench of bodies drifting like grim warnings from the gods. Along the stone causeways slicing through the lake, Spanish soldiers and Tlaxcalan warriors marched toward the heart of a dying world. But before the bloodshed, before the vultures descended, there was a solitary figure who moved silently among the native tribes, whispering that the time had come to turn their backs on Montezuma. Malinche was no warrior. She commanded no army, carried no sword, and sat on no council to issue decrees. But every word she spoke, every secret meeting with tribal leaders, every pact signed out of fear rather than trust, all of it helped erode the Aztec Empire from within. While Cortés and his officers traced lines on maps and traded bullets and blades, Malinche redrew the human heart. She didn't give orders. She simply asked questions. How many of your young men have been taken as sacrifices? How many harvests have been drained to feed a capital that never even sees your faces? How long before your village becomes the next victim? The Aztecs didn't fall because of gunpowder. They fell because their faith bled out. And Malinche was the one who drained it drop by drop. When the siege began, Tenochtitlan still defied belief. Its floating roads, its towering stone temples, its chinampas bursting with life. The Aztec Empire, for all its brutality, was a marvel of organization, architecture, religion, and myth. But now it was suffocating under an ever-tightening noose. The native allies of Cortés, led by Malinche, destroyed the bridges, cut off supply lines, and blocked every canal. For months, the city's people survived on tree roots, leather, even the flesh of one another. This was no longer war, it was the ritual dismemberment of a civilization, with its own former subjects helping lower it into the grave. Montezuma died like a ghost, No one knows exactly by whose hand. Some say Spanish soldiers smashed his skull in frustration. Others claim his own people stoned him to death for being too weak, too submissive to the foreign invaders. But if anyone understood Montezuma's final isolation, it was Malinche. She knew what it was to stand between two worlds tearing each other apart, and belong fully to neither. And when the city fell, when the temple gates collapsed and the waters of Lake Texcoco turned red with the blood of the gods, Malinche stood there silent. No one spoke her name when Cortés declared victory. No one carved her likeness into stone when missionaries raised the Virgin Mary over the ruins. No triumphant songs were sung for the woman who brokered alliances, divided tribes, soothed warlords, and made Spanish words taste sweeter than steel. All she received was silence. And then came the contempt. The Spanish, once they seized the land, no longer needed her. They gave her a bit of land, a few gifts, and a carefully packaged historical forgetfulness. They could not let the world think that their great conqueror once relied on the counsel of an indigenous woman, a former slave. That was too shameful. They could not admit that Malinche was not just a witness, but a key agent in the fall of the Aztecs. So they chose to erase her, or worse, twist her into a symbol of betrayal. The native peoples would not forgive her either. To them, she became the root of all calamity. They didn't see the leaders who had sent tribute to Tenochtitlan for generations. They didn't see the injustice between capital and province, the exhaustion that had been building for centuries. They only saw this, a woman who spoke to the enemy. And after that, everything fell apart. That was enough to condemn her. There's a cruel irony when one compares her to someone in Europe at the time. Jeanne d'Arc, another young woman caught in war, speaking to the divine, used by men, and burned alive by those who once hailed her. But Jeanne was eventually vindicated, canonized, given statues, chronicles, legend. And Malinche? Her name became a curse. In modern Mexican Spanish, Malinchista refers to traitors, sellouts, those who idolize the foreign and betray the homeland. The irony is brutal, because if anyone had no homeland, it was Malinche. She was abandoned by her family, sold like an object, shuffled from tribe to tribe, stripped of her native tongue, and forced to begin again in a different language, a different skin. And when she used her intellect, her cunning, her will to survive, to rise from the depths, people called it betrayal. She didn't fight for Spain. She fought for survival. And in doing so, she witnessed an entire world crumble. Not because she made it fall, but because she saw the rot long before the swords did. All she did was point to the cracks. Others were the ones who smashed them open. After the conquest, Malinche vanished from official history. Some say she died of illness. Some say she married one of Cortés's allies. Some say she bore Cortés's child, becoming the mother of a mixed race. But the one truth that stands is this: no one stood by her. No Spaniard preserved her belongings. No native lit candles for her soul. She belonged to no one, just as, throughout her life, she drifted between worlds that never truly claimed her. But what makes Malinche still haunt us today is not her absence from the record. It's her shadow lingering in Mexico's modern psyche, like a fear no one dares name. She reminds us that women can hold power, but must never show it. That indigenous people can be brilliant, but only within accepted lines. And that anyone who steps beyond those lines, anyone who dares whisper to the conquerors, even to survive, will be erased, cursed, turned into a symbol of everything society doesn't want to face. Malinche did not destroy the Aztec Empire. The powerful men within it did that themselves. Malinche merely held up the mirror, and the reflection they saw of weakness, of pride, of crumbling faith is what they could never forgive. In the final chapter of Tenochtitlan's fall, there is one image never recorded but always imagined. A woman standing on a stone platform, watching the city drown in fire and smoke, holding nothing but a veil in her hands. She does not cry. She does not smile. She only watches, as if, at last, she understands power, no matter how real, can still be swallowed whole by the silence of history. And then she turns away, stepping into the shadows where those who know too much, do too much, but are born at the wrong time are left to be forgotten. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, after the streets had run red with blood and sacred temples were turned into Christian churches, Malinche did not simply disappear. She stepped out of the chaos, out of her roles as translator, negotiator, and general without an army, to become something else, a mother. But she did not give birth to an ordinary child, not the son of a Nawa chieftain, nor a silent slave child destined to vanish into the mists of history. The child Malinche bore was the fusion of two bloodlines, one flowing from the peak of Spanish power, from an empire stretching its claws westward, the other rising from scorched fields, shattered Aztec temples, and prayers in Nahuatl no one dared to remember. Malinche's son with Hernán Cortés, named Martin, was the first recorded mestizo child of mixed indigenous and Spanish descent in the New World. Symbolically, he was the first Mexican in the modern sense, the product of conqueror and conquered. But don't mistake this for some harmonious union. No one celebrated Martin's birth. There were no festivals, no plazas named after him. On the contrary, from that moment on, Malinche began to change in the collective memory. She was no longer the clever woman who escaped slavery, no longer the one who laid the first stones of a new world. She became La Chingada, the fucked one, the violated woman, the traitor who lay with the devil, and her child, despite his noble blood from Cortés, could never escape her shadow. Chingar, in Mexican Spanish, is a verb of nuclear power. Can mean to fuck, to insult, to humiliate, to destroy. And La Chingada, its noun form, is a word used to describe something that has been utterly defiled, used up, and discarded. In the national psyche, Malinche is no longer a person. She became a vessel for deep pain, for the violent ravaging of a nation, by guns, by swords, by seduction, by sex. She is the humiliated mother, and yet blamed as if she had offered herself up. No country truly loves the mother who birthed it if that birth is seen as the result of historical rape. And the tragedy is this: modern Mexico, in all its contradictions, lives within a body born of that very mixture, while being forever compelled to despise and reject the woman who gave it life. Malinche is a wound that never heals. She is a story everyone knows but no one wants to tell with care. Because to admit she is the mother, that she helped shape the very identity of Mexico, is to confront the unbearable truth that this identity was born of submission, of a union that history has never agreed was consensual. Hernán Cortés never married Malinche. He wed a proper Spanish noblewoman, as imperial society dictated. Malinche, once the closest person to him in the pivotal moments of history, was given to one of his trusted captains once her role was done. They said she was rewarded, like a piece of used war booty. From then on, she faded from political life, slipping into the shadows, where her memory would be worn down, torn apart, recycled into a symbol. The complexity lies here. Malinche was not just hated for lying with the enemy, but for speaking their language. She understood them. She translated for them. She made Spanish words sound softer, more believable. In a world where language is the final frontier of identity, she crossed that line, and she was never forgiven. She was no longer purely Nawa, not truly Spanish. She was the silence between two civilizations, merged and at war. And because she lived in the middle, both sides could lay blame on her. There's something strange about post-colonial psychology. The conquered do not only hate the conquerors. That rage often gets directed inward, toward those who opened the doors, who cooperated, who spoke with the enemy. And in Mexican history, no one fits the role of door opener more than Malinche. No matter how many times she acted to survive, no matter how many lives she saved through negotiation, the one remembered truth is this: she stood with the other. She was not one of us. But who is us? That's the most painful question. Because the very us that modern Mexico clings to, the mythical identity tied to the Aztec Empire, to patriotism, to anti-colonial resistance, no longer truly exists. It was broken and dissolved into the hybrid world that Malinche and Cortés created together. Those who curse her as a traitor, as La Chingada, as the Eve of Sin, they're doing it in Spanish, The language she once learned, once translated, once used to bargain for life. Mexicans may hate Malinche, but they cannot live without her in their blood. And it is that contradiction that keeps her name eternally cursed. In popular culture, Malinche is rarely portrayed neutrally. She is either the demon, the naked woman in symbolic paintings, lying with the enemy, or the perfect victim, raped, betrayed, forgotten. Both images are extreme. Both deny her the right to be complex. But the crueler truth is this. Even when she is pitied, that pity is condescending, as if she were a walking shame that needs forgiveness, never allowed to be the protagonist of her own story. Some modern writers and historians have tried to reclaim Malinche. They argue that she was a product of her time, a woman who used intelligence and language to survive in a world where women were traded like livestock. They defend her as an anti-heroine, a symbol of survival in the face of doom. But even this reclamation faces an obstacle not easily overcome: the collective guilt that Mexico has never truly resolved. Because if Malinche was not wrong, then who was? Cortés? The Pope? The King of Spain? The native lords who allied with the Spaniards for their own gain? The Tlaxcalan warriors who burned Aztec villages better than any cannon? No. It's always easiest to blame a woman. And not just because she was a woman, but because she was the first woman who dared speak to the invaders as a human being, not as a slave. That choice, to speak, to survive, to live rather than die as a symbol of purity, is what society has never forgiven. Today, her name still echoes in songs, in literature, in political debate, but rarely as a living character. She is a mirror where every Mexican sees themselves and quickly looks away, because deep down, everyone knows. If they were her, they'd have done the same. But everyone wants to believe they'd have stayed loyal, chosen sacrifice, chosen glorious death over shameful survival. Malinche did not choose death. She chose to live. And for that, history chose to make her a demon. Perhaps, somewhere, if Malinche's spirit still lingers, she is watching over the land she once called home with a bitter smile, a place where her name is spit upon, yet where the children of her blood continue to grow, to love, to write poetry, and to wrestle with the long shadow of a stolen identity. And as fate would have it, they still speak the language she once translated, the language of both betrayal and survival. Malinche, the despised mother, the creator of a nation who was never allowed to be the mother of anyone. Malinche is no longer just a person. She's no longer an individual. After centuries, she has transformed into a linguistic phenomenon, a collective psychology, a spectral image drifting through every sedimentary layer of Mexican identity. People don't just remember Malinche as a historical figure. They remember her as an adjective, a biting word used like a cultural slap, a curse that doesn't need to be shouted to echo through the soul. Malinchista. What is a Malinchista? Someone who favors the foreign over the native. The one who speaks English to seem sophisticated. The kid who turns their nose up at their mother's cooking and craves a hamburger. The person who places faith in Western values and diminishes traditional identity. A quiet traitor. One whose betrayal happens daily, hourly, simply by believing that something from out there is always better. Malinche has become the one comparison no one wants to bear. Because to be a Malinchista is to be disloyal, ungrateful to your homeland, disconnected from your roots. And strangely, in a nation born from the very fusion of Spanish and indigenous worlds, it's precisely there that her shadow is the most unforgivable. As if all of modern Mexican identity suffers from a kind of dissociative disorder, they crave the West, envy the US, chase the French or European dream, yet spit out the name Malinche as if it were an indelible stain. That's why Malinchismo isn't just a social phenomenon. It's a profound inner conflict between two opposing forces within the Mexican psyche: national pride and colonial shame. And in that conflict, Malinche is cast as the villain. But stop for a moment and ask, is it fair for an entire culture to turn a woman's name into an accusation, a social disease? How many men have shaken hands with colonizers, profited off their nation's pain, surrendered without being forced, and yet were never labeled with their own version of a Malinchista slur? Has anyone ever called Cuauhtémoc a coward for failing to save Tenochtitlan? Has anyone cursed Tlaxcala, who helped Cortés besiege the Aztecs, with something like Tlaxcalismo? No. But Malinche, she is marked forever. That's how history works when it's written by men and sustained by patriarchal cultures. Women are never allowed to make choices without paying a price. If they go against men, they're witches. If they go with men, they're traitors. If they stay silent, they're useless. If they speak, they're insolent. And if they survive in a male-dominated world, they must have done something dirty to get there. Sex, cunning, betrayal. Malinche had no army, no formal power, no title, no land. The only thing she had was intelligence and language, and she used them to survive. She didn't launch the conquest, but she lived through it, understood it, and operated within it like someone who could read a hidden map while everyone else fumbled in the dark. That's why people feared her. Her intelligence didn't come from books or decrees. It came from reading hearts in a world where everyone spoke a different language. In her hands, language wasn't a tool. It was power. And so history tried to take that power from her by turning her name into a symbol of shame. People say history is written by the victors. But in Mexico, there's something even more bitter. History is rewritten by victors who want to forget they were once victims. And in that rewriting, Malinche became the scapegoat. Like Joan of Arc burned and later sainted when it was safe, Malinche was burned in the collective imagination, insulted in every cultural conversation, and then rediscovered as a feminist icon, long after it mattered. But the difference is this. Joan died a symbol of resistance. Malinche lived on as a ghost, everywhere and nowhere, ever present but banished from anything sacred. And in every woman forced to choose sides, to act as a bridge, pulled between two clashing male powers, Malinche is reborn. In the immigrant mother forced to translate for her trafficker to save her child. In the schoolgirl caught between a traditional family and a westernized classroom, never allowed to fail. In the diplomat dismissed as a puppet for daring to negotiate instead of pound the table. In every woman judged not by what she does, but by whose side she stands on. We call them Malinchistas as if it's a crime, but many of them are just trying to survive. History has rarely been kind to women, especially those who didn't choose to die quietly. Somehow, Malinche survived colonization, war, betrayal, and reinvention. She didn't die a saint, nor disappear as a slave. She endured, and that endurance is what makes history uncomfortable. Because when a woman lives too long in collective memory, people no longer know whether to love or hate her, to worship or to curse. So they take the easy way. They make her the system error. They blame her for every crack in national pride. When you can't blame the real enemy, blame the woman who spoke to them. Malinchismo isn't just foreign worship. It's proof of a society that has never reconciled with itself. It's the shadow of a history still too afraid to look in the mirror and admit, we were made by mixture, by force, by impossible choices. And Malinche, the one woman who dared walk between those two worlds without turning to stone, is an inconvenient witness to a truth no one wants to say aloud. That identity is not always born from purity. It is often forged from wounds. When we call someone Malinchista, we're not just accusing them. We're resisting our own past, struggling against the shame of not being strong enough to stop the conquest, not united enough to save a civilization, not brave enough to forgive the one woman who understood the language of the death we keep trying to forget. Maybe it's time we stop using that word like a blade and start asking, how many people have been Malinche? How many women in history were pulled into male power struggles and forced to choose, but never allowed to choose for themselves? How many stood in the shadows, branded as traitors just because they saw what others were too afraid to see? Malinche doesn't need to be canonized. She just needs to be seen for what she was. Not a saint, not a villain. Not the mother of a nation or the eve of its downfall. Just a woman who lived through one of the darkest chapters in history and found a way not to be crushed by it. Because in the shadows of betrayal, the survivor is sometimes the only one who speaks two languages, one of the conquerors and one of the conquered. And that's why Malinche will remain. Not as a curse, but as a question no one has dared to answer. Imagine a dusty afternoon, as the sun sets behind the concrete sprawl of Mexico City, casting a dull golden light over the crowded rooftops, over walls covered in graffiti, over people pushing through the streets and their own nostalgia. There, in a fleeting moment no one notices, stands a woman alone in the middle of a vast plaza. She is neither old nor young. Her long black hair drapes over her shoulders. Her face bears the unmistakable features of this land, yet her eyes carry a strange kind of light, the light of someone who has seen too much of what no one wishes to remember. She stands, staring up at a towering monument to national heroes, listening to patriotic hymns blaring from loudspeakers, watching crowds stream past her as if she didn't exist. And perhaps she never really did, not in their hearts. Only her name endures, echoing faintly like a whisper everyone tries to ignore. Malinche, the woman erased from official history but never erased from the nation's imagination. She lingers, in bitter curses, in fears of cultural betrayal, in the rage stirred when someone prefers the foreign over the native, and in that unspoken yearning for a clear, unbroken identity. Every time someone calls another Malinchista, she rises again, not as a ghost but as a mirror modern Mexico dares not look into, for fear of seeing itself smiling at the very invader it swore to hate. Perhaps she looks upon this city with a faint, knowing sadness, understanding that no one truly wants to understand her. Because how could they? How do you forgive a woman who didn't die, who didn't resist loudly, who never screamed for honor, but simply survived? In a world that remembers only glorious resistance and martyrs for the motherland, she is an unsettling headache. She chose to survive, and in a colonial world, survival came at the price of betrayal. But look closer. Did Malinche really betray anyone? Or is it just us? Our eyes tinted with tattered pride, who rewrote her story into something easier to sleep with. She wasn't just Cortez's guide. She was the translator between civilizations, between violence and understanding, between the conqueror and the conquered. She was the bridge no one else dared to be, the one who stood in the rapids while others stayed safely on the shore. Without her, history might have turned out differently. But who's to say it would have been better? Maybe it would have just been another kind of nightmare. She was not merely a traitor. She was a survivor, not just a victim. She was intelligence, not just used. She knew she was being used, and still found a way to endure from within the machinery. Not just the mother of a nation. She was the mother of a new race, even if that race refuses to call her mother. Not just abandoned. She is the memory no one admits they still carry. In that fading evening light, Malinche might see everything Mexico has become. Towering office buildings, billboards in English, tacos served with pizza toppings, children wearing I Red Heart New York shirts headed to French class after Nahuatl lessons. And she might wonder, is this thing they call Malinchismo really a disease? Or is it just the truest face this nation has ever had? And then she turns, quietly stepping into a narrow alley, vanishing into the dusk as if she were never there. But that figure doesn't disappear. She follows us home, into our sleep, into our cultural debates, into every moment we ask ourselves, why do we still feel not quite Mexican enough, no matter how hard we try to prove it? Because the shadow of Malinche doesn't lie outside us. It lives deep within the struggle between identity and shame, between memory and denial, between the urge to reach out to the world and the fear of being labeled a traitor. And the final question still lingers, like a whisper from the woman who lost her name, her homeland, her place in history, yet still drifts through every night wind over Mexico City. If you were Malinche, what would you have done differently, when the only choice you had was to exist?